Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, and secondly, for the kind presentation. I will not make any introductory remarks. I would start with a quotation, which most of you will know, so it's more a reminder than telling you anything new. But I think it serves as an introduction to what I will try to be saying in the course of this presentation. The exploitation of the world market gives a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. It has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations. By industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants requiring for their satisfaction the products of different lands and climes. In place of the old and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. Now, you know by whom this is, I guess, most of you do. So this is from the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, written at the end of 1847 and published in 1848 in many languages. So one can assume that this is itself part of what it is describing. It's a piece of world literature. You're probably, at least the literary scholars here, are also aware of the fact that this last passage, the conclusion of this paragraph, is basically taken straight from Johann Wolfgang Goethe, who some decades earlier had talked about world literature. And by the time Marx and Engels were writing this was published as Goethe's Conversations with Eckermann. Eckermann made this public. So Goethe was indeed claiming that something like world literature was arising in the early 19th century. Now, several remarks on this paragraph and the text to which it belongs. First of all, it may be interesting to recall that it actually was not very widely received at the time it was published. I mean, despite its universal appeal and its translation into many languages. It was rather a few decades later that the authors, Marx and Engels, became more significant actors, well, and scholars. And when this text then also was, well, almost rediscovered, because it had not been very widely known. It was only with the rise of the workers' movement when some people were inclined to think the things which the authors were describing were actually happening somewhat later, and then it only gained momentum. Now, 150 years after the publication of this text, in 1997, there were many events, academic conferences, but also political events commemorating this text. And it was then set in the context of the time, and in most of the contributions to the then ongoing debates at the end of the 20th century, the authors were hailed as having had an enormous predictive capacity, that actually what they were describing was globalization. 150 years before that moment, and they had this foresight that they could actually see and detect the dynamism of the developments that were ongoing then. Now, in my view, in my own view, I think this piece of writing, in particular these passages, they are one of the major misjudgments in the history of the social sciences. I think they got it entirely wrong. And they got it wrong because if one looks at what happens later on, it is not the case that the national form decayed. It was rather created after the middle of the 20th century, in Europe in particular, but they are mostly talking about Europe. I could say more about that later on and how far this is a European text, despite its global appeal. The building of national societies, of national institutions, indeed of national economies, the whole national industry they are talking about, is much more a phenomenon of the time after the manifesto than of the time before the manifesto. trade was much thinner before, but the extension of trade was often wider, and it was more limited in the period of the building of the national economies and societies, mostly from the 1870s onwards. So it is quite extraordinary that the text can be read 150 years later as having been true all along, whereas if you look more closely at what happened after the text was written, and when you monitor with more historical proximity, then it actually turns out that the authors were not at all describing, were not at all capturing what was happening. I will use that as a starting observation and then maybe not come back to the text directly, but you will see later on how I relate to this observation about the historicity of this diagnosis. Now, I think you have asked me to talk here as a sociologist in this interdisciplinary setting. So let me say something about sociology. You don't have to listen now, you know all this. Am I too close or too far? Okay. There's one line of thinking in sociology, it's one line only, but which focuses significantly on the concept of society as the key concept of sociology. It's a key tool with which to analyze social phenomena. And if one then takes a closer look, this society as a concept, when you look at it empirically, it is often taken for granted, without being discussed, that this is national society one is talking about. To give you the one key example, it is the outstanding example from the history of sociological thought. This is Émile Durkheim, and in particular his work, De la division du travail social, translated as The Division of Labor in Society, where he comes up with this very interesting idea that indeed as industry develops, he picks up on all the debate preceding in the 19th century, that there is an increasing specialization of producers and an interdependence of economic agents, and that it is this phenomenon, this is the division of labor, that one no longer produces for self-sufficiency, but one produces to exchange and specializes in the production of some items. Thus, this is Adam Smith, it comes out of political economy, and thus achieves a greater productivity, but at the same time becomes interdependent with other members of society. And this is new. This is what he adds. Well, it is in Smith as well, but it becomes central in Durkheim, namely the argument that due to this interdependence, solidarity arises, and a new form of solidarity, which he called organic solidarity. And he made a big conceptual distinction between this form of solidarity and earlier forms, or not necessarily earlier, also contemporaneous, but outside of industrial social organization, which he called mechanic solidarity. Now, this concept of solidarity and its underlying concept of society has been central for at least one major stream of sociological thinking from that time onwards, from the end of the 19th century onwards. As I said, it really draws on economic thinking, but Durkheim's main project, he was extremely critical of economics and psychology as individualistic disciplines, and he proposed his sociology as an alternative approach, which indeed starts with collective phenomena, and the key collective phenomenon is society, and it generates solidarity. Solidarity is not something that is a sentiment of individual human beings and in relations to others. It is something that emerges out of the form of social organization of society. This is, has been debated endlessly, more recently very strongly criticized, but also in the period already. But it is one of the key components of the history of sociological thought, and it was at that time a highly original and compelling idea, and there certainly is something to it, to the present day. Now, the problem is that if you then look more closely, this is a general concept, a concept of general theory, you could say. But if you look more closely, the underlying assumption is that we talk here about national societies, that they are bounded. We don't even have to think about the national explicitly. Clearly, he was thinking about France. But it's less important whether we talk about nations. It's more important that we talk about boundedness. Because the whole idea of this solidarity creating interdependence only works with an idea of closure. If there is no closure, if there are just extended networks of exchange with variable extensions, thus no boundary that includes all of them, the whole theoretical argument falls. Then there is no reason to assume that this kind of organic solidarity, the metaphor is important, he thinks of society in organicistic terms, in analogy to a body. And in the same way in which a body has boundaries, so this kind of society also needs boundaries. Now, this is obviously a far-fetched assumption to think about social life as always being organized in these bounded forms. Why did it become compelling at the time of Durkheim's writing? Why was it accepted and even marking much of further debate? Well, because it coincided with the creation of bounded institutions, not simply borders of states. That existed before, but it is in his time of writing that these borders of states were accompanied by or were complemented with boundaries of social institutions. The simplest and most obvious example is the customs officer or the border control police officer. Without them, you wouldn't be able to control the extensions of social relations and make them bounded within any given social space. But there is much more than that. There are the national institutions built in the 19th century, national military service, compulsory schooling, the whole kinds of cultural institutions that then go with it, universities which become much more nationally oriented in the 19th century. So what Durkheim was conceptualizing in general theoretical terms was persuasive to some extent only because it coincided with the historical moment in the area of the world where he was living, not in other areas of the world, in Europe. There is a French historian, Gérard Nouriel, who already in the early 1990s wrote a book actually about the right to asylum. That's the key topic of the book. But its subtitle is The Nationalization of European Societies, where he goes in detail through archival work to show how, the focus is there also on France, but it holds for many other societies as well, how European societies were actually much less bounded in the early 19th century in the social sense. The formal boundaries certainly existed. And they became much more so in the later 19th century, that, for instance, movement across societies became much more difficult. And this is related to the fact also to the building of the early welfare state. Because if you didn't have any social rights, the states didn't have a particular interest in control movements across borders. And if there was no democracy, then also whether those people who move are citizens and have the right to vote didn't matter. But at the end of the 19th century, social rights, political rights, slowly and gradually became more widespread. So you needed to, from the state's perspective, to control movements of people, to bound social and political institutions. Now, what I want to underline here is that this is a historical process where there is no a priori reason to think that it should be the basis for a general theory. I'll come back to that later on. Now, that's the question of the problem of sociological theory with the national and the global. There's also a problem with empirical information, with the data, and it is related to this because it is, even though states had created statistics, which is really the knowledge of the state, earlier, but again, from the middle of the 19th century, national statistics emerged much more strongly. And this has led to a situation where, increasingly so, and up to the present day, where most of the, at least numerical, quantitative information sociologists work with are statistics produced by states. And they're normally produced for phenomena within the boundaries of that state. So they are national statistics, nation-state statistics. Which means that very often the only kind of moderately reliable statistics we have, we as sociologists or as social scientists in general, is nation-state produced statistics, nation-state produced data, and everything else we have is much less reliable. I mean, there are obviously quantitative comparisons that use other data. There are now UN-produced data or data from other international organizations. but in many cases, they are not very reliable. You can't really do very serious scholarship with them. Now, this is I want to give you one example to show why this is significant, also even topical. We all talk about social inequality and rising social inequalities today. Now, what we normally do in finding out whether this is the case, whether social inequality rises, we use the Gini index, which was created by Corrado Gini, actually head of this Italian Statistical Institute, appointed by Benito Mussolini himself in the late 1920s, or late 1920s, I think. So he had clearly also a concern with state-based knowledge. But he produced this index, which is used to the present day, and it is used with national data. And as such, it indeed tells something. It is reliable to some extent. It is a figure that shows, I won't go into the technical details, whether inequality rises or decreases over time. But it is only telling if there are also debates about that. There are many criticisms, but which are criticisms that then try to improve the information that goes into this index to become more telling about what is relevant about inequality. This is an internal debate. Overall, we can assume that the movements of this indicator, they indeed tell us something. And you can see that indeed for most European societies, now West and East, we see that inequality rises over the past 2 or 3 decades. We can also see, for instance, that in Brazil, since the early 2000s, the Gini index moves in the opposite direction, that social inequality has decreased in Brazil. It's one of the few societies in the world where this is the case, and it is actually quite clearly due to the politics of Lula as a president. The social policies that were introduced under the Lula presidency. So within national societies and in terms of the changes the index makes visible, it is telling. But it doesn't tell us anything at all about phenomena that are not in the reach. And since we also talk about migration a lot today, we have lots of people moving from one society to another or trying to do so. We have also arguments about global inequality, which are actually very contested. You find people nowadays who claim that global inequality is rising, just like inequality rises in Western societies. And you have people who say the opposite. They can both say that because we don't have an agreement about how to measure that, and there are different ways as to how to measure that. You can, for instance, see that in many societies in the world, even non-Western societies, inequality also rises. Brazil is an exception. South Africa has been an exception for some time. But in China, for instance, inequality rises. But if you look globally and compare societies, then inequality is not necessarily rising, and that has to do with the so-called emerging economies, like the Chinese one, who actually become less unequal compared to the advanced, so-called advanced societies. So basically, I just want to say, since there is no agreement on how to measure it, and there are different ways of posing the question, whether inequality rises globally or decreases cannot really be said. One can debate it, and you can put forward arguments for and against, but you cannot make any conclusive statement about that, in contrast to national societies. So that shows that the limitation of data is a limitation to the kind of knowledge we can have, to the way we can address which are topical problems, like the one of inequality. Now this has, you know that this has given rise to a debate about what has been called methodological nationalism within sociology, and attempts to overcome that. I actually think that debate is sometimes a bit exaggerated because what I've been saying right now has been recognized by many sociologists. The problem is that it's very difficult to do something about it. In the latter case, because of the data, which we don't have, and in the former case, and which no one produces for us, and in the former case, in the case of the theoretical argument, because we don't have any way to replace the Durkheimian argument about solidarity with regard to the global division of labor today. I've don't know whether I should try to say something more about that, but maybe I just leave that hanging for the moment, and if you want, we can come back to that. Now, I want to say that there is an awareness of these issues, and there are different ways, research strategies to address them. They are always piecemeal. You can always only improve on data somewhat, go one step forward, or amend the theoretical construction. There is no overall compelling new strategy to deal with that. What has happened in those 1990s I was referring to before, when so many people thought that Marxist and Engels' analysis had been true for 1.5 centuries and become ever more true, was the argument about the two main processes, globalization and individualization. That has been a sociological debate in the 1990s, and it still goes on. And it is a very peculiar argument because it basically draws on the insights I have mentioned, but draws a radical conclusion, saying that all those social forms that existed before, nations, states, societies, classes, that they all disintegrate. They're all on the way to disappear. And what we have, what we will have, what we have are two main tendencies, globalization and individualization. So what we will have, if these tendencies continue, is a globe populated by individuals, without any kinds of structured social relations or social structures between them, or social cultural structures, if you want. Of course, this had been the main item of sociology, to talk about social structures, the impact they have, how they determine thought, possibilities for action, power, domination. That is what sociology had been doing. Now, if there is globalization, individualization, all of this is going to disappear. And sociology has nothing more to say about its, at least about its traditional topics. Well, if you look around in the world, this is certainly untrue. We may have both of these tendencies if we take globalization to mean that we have, by and large, processes of wider extensions of social relations and of networks of social relations, that we do communicate, interact, exchange with more distant people and more of those more distant people than at other times in history. We may also have individualization in the sense that human beings are less and less tied to the collective cultural context in which they grow up. To be born into a working class family doesn't mean any longer that one grows up with working class consciousness, that one associates with other workers. And, well, by and large, the same for religious collectivities or other kinds of collectivities. So this may also, by and large, be true, even though with this latter regard, we have an extended debate about new forms of cultural collectivities, new forms of collective identities, so there is also a counter-argument. Basically, what I'm saying here is that the one main general new way of thinking in terms of globalization and individualization has some basis in observations, but not very good ones. Certainly it doesn't allow the conclusion that everything social between the globe and the individual is bound to disappear. This just poses the question anew, one can say. It doesn't give an answer to it. That far, since my diagnosis of the state of debate in sociology. And now I want to come to what I think one can do about that. At least what I think more promising ways are to address issues of that kind. First of all, I want to suggest that instead of talking about, as one used to do, the national society as the unit of analysis and comparative analysis as comparing those units, on the one hand, or on the other hand, just talking about globalized networks of relations, we should do something else, and we talk about degrees of connectedness. If you want to look around in the literature, I actually think the argument is becoming more widespread. I think even though it's conceptually very short, but in the most compelling way, it probably has been proposed by Jürgen Osterhammel in his global history of the 19th century called The Transformation of the World, in which he frames his whole history of the 19th century in terms of degrees of connectedness. What is important about this way of formulating it, you may find that a bit clumsy to talk about degrees of connectedness. But what it helps to do is, first of all, to think that these degrees of connectedness, that they vary over time. Well, this is still something that globalization also says, but globalization assumes a linear trend of change, that the degrees of connectedness just increase over time. If we talk about degrees of connectedness, we also allow for reversals, that degrees of connectedness, that connectedness may decrease in certain periods or for certain phenomena. This is important if we look at the Communist Manifesto again, because this is what happened and what Marx and Engels did not expect, that they saw these processes of extending economic relations and intellectual relations with world literature. They did not foresee that this process could also be reversed by conscious political action, building national, social, and political institutions. They didn't have a clue about that at that time of writing in 1847. So this is the one change with the new term. The second one is that it also allows, and Osterhammer does that, to differentiate between different walks of social life, different areas of action, so that we can say then that for certain kinds of phenomena, we may have increasing degrees of connectedness, but for others, stability or decreasing degrees of connectedness. Let me come briefly to this period between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, 1870 to 1914, to the beginning of the First World War, as the rough dates. What we have there is actually, to some extent, a reversal of the economic globalization that Marx and Engels saw they were observing, because especially in the later decades of the 19th century, protectionism started, that the chains of economic exchange, they were reduced or cut down, even though against the background of very strong dynamics of increasing degrees of connectedness before. We have, interestingly, you could call it political or institutional globalization, very much emphasized in the same period. So international norms were created in that period across all walks of life. I mean, the post offices got international organized according to the same rules. French became the language of the postal services. Industrial norms were internationalized or globalized. So you have institutionally a strong intensification of connectedness. You have, there's an interesting section, you have to some extent the same about the sciences, I might say, more the hard sciences, where international cooperation starts more strongly, and also communication, that it becomes less common for certain scientific findings to remain confined to the area where they are produced. They globalize more quickly. Osterhammer has an argument about the arts, which is also very interesting. I added a bit anecdotically, because he says, he refers to the visual arts, mostly painting, and he suggests that something peculiar happens, that for the first time in art history, I know there are art historians around here, maybe I have to be careful, that there is something like the development of a global standard of appreciation of the visual arts. And that this emerges in Paris, basically, and that the Paris art scene becomes the center of the art world, to which all the rest of the world connects. And this is unprecedented in the arts, according to Osterhammer. And maybe some of you have seen that. There was a few years ago an exhibition in the Centre Pompidou about modernité plurielle, which actually takes up that argument with the help of collections from Paris museums and from museums in other parts of the world, where they try to show that on the one hand, indeed, Paris set the standard, but that on the other hand, you could also see that while artists in other parts of the world referred to Paris, that they didn't subordinate themselves, that they used their own artistic context and merged it or blended it with the Paris standard. Which is I use that as an example to show you that once you talk about degrees of connectedness, you can differentiate. You can look at different realms, and you look then empirically to show indeed what kind of connectedness is there. And the argument also helps me introducing another element, namely that element of hierarchies. Because we do not only talk about connectedness as such, but we are also interested in the question whether within those connections there are hierarchies, there are standards in the sense, the Paris standard in the arts, and what it means and how far being placed at a certain moment in a chain of a certain place in a chain of interactions enables you or constrains you to do what you want to do. You can develop center-periphery arguments about that, but you don't have to phrase it in those terms. You can also be empirically more open and ask the question about changing degrees of constraints and enablements due to increases or decreases of connectedness. Now, so this is, in a sense, this is one conceptual tool I suggest to introduce to get a better grip on the transformations in spatial phenomena, spatially organized social phenomena that we want to analyze. Now, let me introduce another one by suggesting a certain focus. This, you could say, is maybe more my own preference in that area, but let me convey it to you more openly, and then I propose my own ideas about that. If we talk about degrees of connectedness, there are, of course, different ways in which we can measure that. If we can find out what actually takes place, whether the degree of connectedness increases, is stable, or decreases. For economic matters, there are certain, the most abstract standards. Again, one can always look more concretely, but the most abstract standards are very clear. For instance, the increasing degree of connectedness, globalization, if you want to call it like that, is measured by the relation between world trade and world production. So if world trade increases more quickly than world production, then we have globalization. So more of what is produced in any given place is traded elsewhere, and less of it is consumed, to take up Marx's formulation, in the place where it is produced. In turn, when production increases more quickly than trade, or changes, then we have decreasing degrees of connectedness. If you look at economic history, we see very clearly that in the late 18th century, we have, for some time, very quickly increasing globalization, economic globalization, or increasing degrees of connectedness. Then this slows down with protectionism, and between the two world wars, there is a reversal. Then production grows more quickly than trade, or rather trade falls and production is either stable or grows somewhat. So the degrees of economic connectedness diminish in the interwar period to then increase again, especially in the first quarter of a century after the Second World War. That's a period of, again, very quickly increasing degrees of connectedness economically. Then again, you can move that to different areas. You can make analysis in terms of migration, migration in relation to population. Actually, these figures are much smaller than one thinks if one reads the newspapers. Actually, only a very small part of the world population migrates. Most of them are sedentary. Or with regard to literature, obviously translation is a measure for that, that Goethe already had that in mind, that you can do it in quasi-economic terms, in terms of the relation between the number of translated, say, novels in relation to the number of novels written. If the number of translations increases more quickly than the number of, we probably wouldn't do that, but we can develop some indicator of increasing degrees of connectedness due to the amounts or proportions of translation. Now, this is interesting to work with such indicators, but that is my main argument. It is not sufficient because we still lack the tools for understanding what is happening there. And for that, we need something else. Understanding in terms of both the causes, what brings this about, the changes in the degree of connectedness, and what are the consequences, what follows from that. And for that, and those of you who have looked at this World Sociology article, you will have seen the argument there. I think we need forms of world interpretation, ways of situating oneself in the world. And for that, it's important to introduce a distinction between the terms globe and world. Globe is the term that refers to the planet, to the Earth, on which we all live, whereas world is a term that refers to our way of situating ourselves on that planet and in relation to others. And in that sense, there has been, for some time in French debates, that has subsided. Now you can't find it any longer, I would suggest, a distinction between globalisation and mondialisation. Jean-Luc Nancy wrote about that, and he was indeed suggesting that globalization, the term should be used for the actual material extension of practices like trade, migrating people, number of translations, whereas mondialisation, world making, I would call that, refers to the interpretation, to the meanings human beings give to their being in the world. And these two things are significantly different. We can well have increasing globalization in that sense without having world consciousness. Indeed, Hannah Arendt, already writing in the 1950s, at the end of the 1950s, was using the term worldlessness, referring to actually to the increasing diffusion of industrial production, mostly, the modern condition of the human being. But you can easily refer it to materially extended global relations without human beings understanding that or being able to position themselves within this context. They lose world while global extensions are created. World in the sense of giving meaning, of interpreting meaningfully one's place in the world. Now, once one makes this difference, one shouldn't lose out of sight the more material elements, but one can develop tools for understanding them better. And elements for that I try to develop in this article, where I suggest that if we look at the globe and the way human beings inhabit it, in particular over the last 5 centuries, then, not excluding the periods before, but just to have some focus at least, then we can see that society, social life is practically always characterized by forms of domination, but also that domination to varying degrees is in need of justification. If human beings dominate others, they are very rarely able to do that by sheer violence. There will be, this also happens, but much more commonly, forms of domination are accompanied by some kind of justification for it. This can vary widely, and I will not say more about that now. If you want, we can talk about it more later. But these justifications, to continue on the general argument without going into the broad detail, they can be more or less explicit, that is important, and they can be more or less exposed to critique. Now, maybe I should give you at least one general idea, which to some extent, I don't want to go too far, but applies also rather widely to world history, that forms of domination, even without being explicit, are often justified by some service that dominating groups provide to all of society, or the dominated groups. This can be safety, that they protect the borders against enemies, or it can indeed be material well-being, that they are able to arrange production and distributions in their settings in such a way that people survive well or more or less well. And the argument is that some form of domination is required for this, or is useful for doing those services to society better than if there were no domination. But as regards critique, this can be criticized in 2 basic ways. The one way is to accept the general argument, but to say that what the dominating groups are actually doing is they are not fulfilling these functions well. They are just enriching themselves, they are exploiting the population, so that something has to change, but the basic argument is accepted. Or the more radical argument is that the basic argument is not accepted, that we don't really need a dominating class for creating security or material well-being, that it can be done in other ways. That is the more radical form of critique. And any form of domination, at least potentially, is subject to these forms of critique, the one or the other. I want to add, maybe, because it may be an interesting part of discussion, if one looks at world history in that way, we find these arguments. They are, Marx was one contributor to that kind of debate, as you surely know. But they often come in two versions. The one is suggesting basically that what emerges from this kind of social constellation is something more cyclical, that domination can indeed be criticized and also overcome, but the result will be that a new form of domination is introduced, so that in principle nothing changes. That is an argument you find in Wilfredo Pareto at the beginning of the 20th century, the idea of circulation of the elites and the elites having to rationalize their domination. And you find it in at least in some readings of Foucault, so across the 20th century. You also have the other argument that there is indeed a historical process of emancipation or of liberation, which means that even though with obstacles and delays, but what actually happens in world history, that gradually one will get rid of domination, that human beings will generally emancipate themselves and will be equally free. That's the more optimistic argument which you find from the Enlightenment onwards. You find it in Kant in a different version in Hegel, on which Marx drew, and you find it today in as different thinkers as the current protagonists of the Frankfurt School, like Axel Honneth, also Jürgen Habermas before, or in terms of decolonial thinkers like Enrique Dussel, the Mexican philosopher. You find both of these versions, the more skeptical, so to say, and the more optimistic one, throughout the past 2 centuries. What I want to suggest is that we don't have any reason to assume that either of the two is true, but that we have to take a closer look, a more nuanced and a more observation-based look at transformations across world history. And then I will conclude with, well, maybe I should conclude indeed, with just a few remarks. Those of you who had time to read the paper will see a bit more detail about that there. That these two elements, the observation on degrees of connectedness and the observation on ways of world interpretation, and in particular critiques of domination, lend themselves to a new reading of world history, in which elements like the so-called discovery of the New World and the arguments about the human rights of the Native Americans, as in the Las Casas de Pulvera debates, mark a new degree of connectedness and a new degree of critical debate about domination and overcoming domination. Secondly, the late 18th, early 19th century, with the French Revolution and its overall context, marks another such moment, which is a moment also of very rapidly increasing degrees of connectedness. Militarily, the Napoleonic Wars, but also intellectually, ideologically, with the spreading of broadly Enlightenment thought. And what we have since then, we have or throughout the 19th century, we have a discrepancy, a tension between, on the one hand, what I call the democratic political imaginary, which actually expresses the hopes for political emancipation, political liberation, on the one hand, but the fact that this is not at all realized in political institutions which work with restrictions to participation. And this tension moves much of the 19th century, political and social change in the 19th century. What it also does, and that is a phenomenon then of the later 19th century and much of the 20th century, is the displacement of these conflicts. When you see that northern elites give in to this tension, they accept more and more, even though grudgingly, the democratic imaginary, but they do so by displacing the conflict upon nature, increased exploitation of nature due to industrialization, to increase material well-being, to give in to claims, but exploiting nature, and through colonial exploitation, which increases from the late 19th century onwards through the first half of the 20th century. There is, in that sense, and that is part of this ambiguity which this perspective allows us to see, that the increasing degree of connectedness, this period of globalization around 1900, allows to have normative achievements in one part of the world, but at the expense of other parts of the world, which the connectedness allows, which would not have been possible, say, in 1700, where the degree of connectedness was much lower. Well, the last word is on the recent situation, but about that I could talk for another few hours, is namely the argument that we live in a new constellation since the end of the 20th century, with the end of colonialism, with the end of with the ecological debate about the limits of the planet, of the limits to the inhabitability of the planet, and with the not full but widespread achievement of freedom and equality of individuals, not in all parts of the world, but widespread. These are all events that only come to full fruition from the 1970s onwards. But we live now in this new constellation, which indeed requires new tools for understanding that. And my optimistic perspective is that developing some of these tools and applying them also empirically to world society and world history will allow us to understand this better. Thank you for your attention.